Thank you again for joining this public talk. It's a great honor for us to be here with you, and we really appreciate the work of the organizers, the volunteers, and everyone who is attending. To be honest, we proposed our public talk last minute, and we are therefore super grateful for the organizers that they got us in the program. And today we want to start with a short announcement and short introduction. Maybe some of you heard that in Russia on Friday night in Moscow there was a terrorist attack, and several hundreds of people became victim of this attack. Already more than 130 people died from this attack. It was a mass shooting. Several armed men came to the big concert hall in Moscow and started shooting people. And for us as activists from Russia, it is important to address that, because in Russia today is an official mourning day because of this terrorist attack, and we want to show and address our condolences to all the people who were affected by this terrible attack. And at the same time, for us, it is important to say that we as people who were oppressed by Russian government, by Russian secret services, have no trust to the Russian government who is making investigation of this terrorist attack. So we have no base to believe to anything that Russian government says about this investigation. And this is very sad, and this makes us very angry because we will hardly know the truth, what really happened.
Yeah, I'm an activist from Moscow, and this terrorist attack happened in Moscow, and when you are an activist in Moscow, it's very easy for the government to arrest you, to detain you, and somehow it doesn't work with the terrorists. So we want to say that our country, Russia, is actually terrorizing another country, Ukraine, every day. Russia is terrorizing Syria every day. So we put all the blame on what happened in terrorist attack on Russian regime, on Russian criminal regime, and yeah. But obviously, innocent people, they shouldn't suffer anywhere in Moscow or in Ukraine or anywhere else. So yeah, probably we can have a minute of silence.
Yeah, I will just add something really quickly about the context. So, of course, there are investigations of other international secret services saying that ISIS were the actors of this terrorist attack. At the same time, we put responsibility on the Russian government as well, because for many, many years, for 24 years of Putin's reign, he was selling this image, his own image, as a savior of Russia, as a person, the only one who will bring Russia safety, stability, and protection. But during his 24 years of reign, he was focusing on terrorizing activists, independent journalists, queer people. A couple of days ago, there was a first criminal case established in Russia against queer people as extremists. So they are, searching and oppressing people like me and Arshak, queer activists in Russia, and presenting us as terrorists, while putting all their resources to, try to oppress grassroots activist movement, anti-war movement, anti-Putin opposition. At the same time, of course, they have lack of resources to prevent real terrorist cases, and this makes us very, very angry. So yeah, we will want to start from a minute of silence.
Yeah, but not just to Russian people who died, but also Ukrainians, because Russia is bombing Ukraine every day. We shouldn't forget about what is happening in Ukraine, and everything is happening on fossil fuel money from Europe and everywhere else.
Thank you very much. And now we will start our public talk. Unfortunately, today there's only two of us, me and Arshak. We planned a third person to be with us, decolonial activist Yana Tanagasheva, but she wasn't able to join us today. Here on the slide you can see our contacts, so if you are interested in anything to connect with Russian activists, to learn more information about anything that happens in Russia, to contact activists from other groups, you can always feel free to contact me and Arshak. We will be grateful to build these connections with you. And I think we will start with saying a couple of things about us. Maybe Arshak, you will start.
Yeah, this is a conference against gas, actually an activist conference, and it's really difficult to imagine something like this in Russia. Like any kind of gathering of more than 2 persons in Russia is illegal. So I was a climate activist in Russia. Like, climate activist in Russia was completely different from your experiences in Austria, in Germany, and everywhere else. We started to do it in 2019, and we started to build the climate movement in a fossil fuel state. Russian people, they had no knowledge about climate crisis, even though it was happening in our countries, because all media resources were concentrated in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and they were talking about Putin and stuff like that, but nobody talked about real problems, about climate crisis. And yeah, we were trying to build climate movement, we were trying to change our country, and now everything what we were trying to build is destroyed. All environmental organizations in Russia are declared foreign agents or undesirable organizations or extremists for trying to defend the nature. And yeah, I was deprived of my only citizenship in Russia because of my activism, and my family was deported. So this is how they treat minorities and activists who are trying to change something. Yeah, and obviously, as a climate activist, I was against full-scale invasion in Ukraine, and I was speaking up, and with other activists we were demanding embargo on Russian fossil fuels. But still, there are a lot of loopholes, and Europe is continuing to finance Russian regime while they are putting all the blame on like Russian activists and Russian exiled activists on everyone else. But still, they're financing them, helping them to continue the war, and it's really terrible.
Yes, and my name is Lölja. I'm originally from St. Petersburg, Russia, and I have been under political repression since January 2021, even though I have been very active for years in feminist movement in Russia. I was environmental activist as well. I was participating in different oppositional protests, organizing them, also organizing feminist and queer events. And since 2021, secret services of Russia starting going after me because they were trying to put pressure on many activists, starting from those who were more visible, I would say, in social media, because I was, for example, and I'm still running actively my social media blogs. So for Secret Service of Russia, it's not only important to arrest you and block you from your work as an activist, it's also important to make your case an example for other people to be scared. So they're interested in starting with people who have some audience as well. And first I had only administrative cases where you are charged with fine, you need to pay some money after being arrested, or you're arrested for a few days. But after 2022, after the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, a criminal case, a criminal terrorism case was established against me and several other activists, and lawyers who helped me told me that this was a signal for me that this is like the last red line, and if I don't leave the country now, I might go to prison for a long period of time. So my decision was to flee Russia in March 2022, to be able to save my health, save my freedom, and continue my activism from abroad. Unfortunately, not many people were as lucky as me. Some people didn't have time to flee Russia. For some activists, it was their principal choice to stay in Russia, even though they were aware about their risks. But I know people for whom it was a decision, no, we know that they are going to put us in prison for a long time, but we won't go because this is our home, this is our struggle. And of course, we respect this principle as well. And on the second day of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I was, together with feminist activists from other regions of Russia, we established a grassroots movement called Feminist Anti-War Resistance. And now it is a large movement with groups inside Russia, which are anonymous, and groups of activists who had to flee all over the world. And we are all building our grassroots feminist resistance against Putin, against Russian aggression in Ukraine, and against all the right-wing values that Putin tries to promote and reinforce in Russia and in the whole world. So right now I'm currently based in Vienna, continuing my activism here, and I'm very interested, and me and Arshak and all of us, not to stay in our bubble of our local activist initiatives. We are very interested in building international coalitions, and we feel like there is often, even when we meet activists from other countries, there's a lack of knowledge what is really going on in Russia, because it's a very large country with different regions, with different contexts. So we are interested to building these connections and raising the awareness what is happening, and finding the ways how we can together collaborate to fight these right-winger powers worldwide.
Yeah, I was a part of Fridays for Future movement, of international movement, and we were organizing Fridays for Future movement in Russia. And when I was arrested in 2019 for 6 days, it was really inspirational that activists in Europe, they were protesting all around, like not just in Europe, all around the world. They were protesting in support of me, and it gave me a lot of safety afterwards, and like I was not arrested for years like many of my other friends, activists. So I think like building this solidarity between us is really important, and that's one of the reasons why we are here. We want to build new alliances, yeah, because these dictators, they work together, they cooperate, they help each other. And for example, yeah, we were demanding embargo on Russian fossil fuels for a long time, and now finally we have something like an embargo, but it's not really working effectively. But at the same time, like I was protesting for an embargo on fossil fuels from Azerbaijan. Probably you don't know much about Azerbaijan. It's a small country in Caucasus, but yeah, they organized the blockade of Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, and while Europe was launching new deals with Azerbaijan, buying more and more gas from Azerbaijan, and then finally they organized the ethnic cleansing of indigenous population of Nagorno-Karabakh. They deported 100,000 people, and Europe still continues to buy these fossil fuels from Azerbaijan. And I'm really surprised that even activists in Europe, they don't speak up about it. And it's really strange, and it shouldn't be like this. Because Russia started full-scale invasion of Ukraine, then it inspired Azerbaijan to start ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, which inspired then Israel, and yeah, and you know what is happening right now in Palestine. And we should stop this kind of terror. Yeah, it's not just about Romania or Ukraine or Palestine, it's all about saving our democracy, saving basic values of us being able to live on this planet, being able to continue our resistance for a livable future. So if we want to fight for our future, at first we should be helping to most vulnerable communities to save their present.
Yeah, and I also want to say a bit of organizational info that we don't plan to talk all 2 hours here by ourselves. We want to share some arguments that we have and then to talk with you, and so you could exchange your opinions about the topic or ask some questions, and we can make it more discussion than our lecture or something like this. And I want to say that what other thing that makes us really angry is that fossil fuels are still being exported from Russia to Europe in a very large scale. An enormous, huge amount of money from fossil fuel business still flows directly into Putin's pocket. And specifically, since I'm living currently in Austria, I'm very pissed off about this status of neutrality of Austria, because I understand that this is like military neutrality, and it doesn't necessarily mean political neutrality, but you can't be neutral in a situation of war when the money that you are paying for the gas, for the fossil fuels, are going directly to finance Russian war machine, Russian military aggression in Ukraine. Without this enormous amount of fossil fuel money, Putin and his gang won't be able to perform this colonial violence. And it's important to underline that this violence in Ukraine is a colonial violence, because Putin is a person who has colonial ambitions, imperialistic ambitions, and he realizes it not for the first time. It's not the first war that he has established during his 24 years of reign, and maybe you, Arshak, can also elaborate on that.
Yeah, we should. People in Europe really don't know that Russia is really a colonial empire. People, they don't know that Russia is kind of a federation, but it's really not. Like, there are a lot of different kind of people in Russian Federation, and most of the damage to environment is happening in republics, in regions, for example, in Bashkortostan, in Kemerovsky region, in Komi Republic, in Chechnya, Dagestan, everywhere, all around Russian Federation. And people, indigenous people in Russia, national minorities in Russia, they suffer the most. And when you buy cheap gas, when you buy cheap coal or oil, you don't really know the real price of these cheap fossil fuels. For example, I went to Kemerovsky region, and like I told you, some indigenous people, coal companies, they were burning down their homes to open new coal mines, or they were kind of killing them, making them flee, repressing, and it's happening all over Russia. People in Europe, they don't know that Russia is colonial empire. They think like Russia is fighting the US imperialism or whatever, but it's not. Russia is empire. They are repressing all different kind of people all around Russia. There is a reason why Russia is the biggest country in the world. You don't know about it, but yeah, Russia is the biggest country in the world. And it's really crucial for us to speak up about these kind of things, to support Russian minorities, to support Russian republics in their fight for at least like some equality, yeah, and some justice. And because if we want to be doing that, then we won't have a future. Russia is on the 4th place for CO2 emissions. That was the reason why I stayed in Russia and continued doing activism, even though it was really dangerous before 2022. And that's why we should be talking about this kind of stuff more. You cannot save the planet by changing climate policies just in Austria, for example.
Yeah, and also indigenous activists from Russia always point out that there's mostly there's no such things as Russian fossil fuels, because these fossil fuels that Russia exports to Europe, to other countries, these fossil fuels are extracted from the indigenous land. These fossil fuels can be extracted as a result of exploitation of indigenous people by Russian government, by these huge fossil fuel companies. It's not only, there's one angle to look at on these connections, for example, the connection between fossil fuel money and how this money is used to, feed this Russian war machine. And at the same time, there's another angle how you can look at it to see that Russian fossil fuel is the result of colonial imperialistic violence that is happening in Russia, that it is performed by Russian government onto indigenous lands, indigenous people, national republics in Russia. And the Russian government is a very xenophobic, racist government, even though in Russia there are so many different ethnical groups, indigenous people are living on their territories, and still Russian government is very, this is so cynical, but they say that, yeah, we are a country with different ethnic groups, with different people and different indigenous communities, but still they are promoting this very racist, very white supremacist, very pro-white Slavic kind of agenda, which is completely, doesn't relate to the reality of who is actually living in the territory of Russia. So I think it is not addressed enough in Europe, because when I'm speaking to European activists about Russian gas and Russian fossil fuels, I rarely hear that they are aware about this colonial context, the context of colonial violence inside Russia and outside of the country. And I would like to say also that this kind of neutrality, coming back to the issue of Austria, is also very beneficial to Putin, because there are not that much allies of Putin in Europe. As you might heard, Putin always says all the bad things about the collective West, promotes ideas that West and Western Europe are the enemies of the Russian state, the enemies of the Russian traditional values, because in Europe everybody, is gay and just doing everything, their main goal of Western and European people to destroy Russian traditional values. And at the same time, still Putin is very interested in having right-winger governments in Europe, because when you have right-winger governments, the values that Putin supports are promoted. For example, even if the right-winger government of your country doesn't support Putin directly, as for example it happens in Italy right now with their right-wing government, they don't directly support Putin, they're against Putin, but still they are promoting the values that Putin is interested to promote, against migrants, against queer people, racist, xenophobic values. So every right government in Europe is beneficial to Putin, and every right-wing government, the more you have right-wing governments in Europe, the more Putin gets stronger, because he's interested in expanding these right-wing values all over the world.
Yeah, actually, a lot of European politicians, they are blaming Russians for not doing enough to have a revolution in Russia. Even though we were protesting for years, we were risking our freedom and everything, while European politicians were having a lot of deals with Putin, they were buying more gas, but it's okay, yeah. And that's the reason why in most of the countries it's nearly impossible to organize changes, because these regimes, they have a lot of money to organize their propagandas in Europe, inside the countries, everywhere. Most of you actually are influenced by Russian propaganda, even though you don't know about it. It's very easy for them to buy a few politicians in your country. It's very easy for them to buy a few media in your country. They have a lot of money. They invest this money in their propaganda. They invest this money in their wars. And yeah, they want you to be afraid of them. A lot of Europeans are actually more afraid of Putin than we are, even though we have friends, families in prison and whatever. But giving up is not an option to dictatorship. We do not want to live in dictatorship in Russia or in Europe. That's why we continue to speak up, and I think you should be joining us to resist to Putin, because this war is not about Europe, or this Russian empire is not just about Russia. It's about the concept of imperialism, and it's terrible. And I don't say that you don't have the same problems here. You have them, but on a different scale. Yeah, like Western world, they launched a lot of terrible wars, they committed a lot of terrible crimes, but crimes committed by Western world in Palestine, it's not an excuse for crimes Putin is committing in Ukraine. And it's really important for us to understand that we shouldn't like allow one empire to commit crimes because another empire is also terrible. We should be fighting for our values, we should be united by our values, and that's why we are here, and it's really great that we have this platform, and probably we can start the discussion. So
I think maybe two last points from our list of arguments left, and then we are still on time actually, because it's still only 38 minutes have passed of our talk. So yeah, I would like to elaborate a bit more on this subject of like why Russians aren't fighting Kremlin and police with their bare hands and making a revolution. I'm very sick of hearing these arguments, especially from Western, like USA activists and European people, Western European people in general, who never experienced living in authoritarian state, who never experienced living under dictatorship, who never been imprisoned or arrested or experienced police brutality, violence or rapes in the police stations. So I want to say that a lot of Russian people, millions of Russian people, and we have 140 millions of people living in Russia, millions of these people are against the regime. But not everyone can risk the safety of their lives, their families, and become, you know, an activist who is going to fight policemen, armed police officer, basically trained soldier whose only job is to beat the shit out of you and to imprison you. Not everyone has a privilege in a way and certain possibilities to do these risks, you know? For example, okay, I don't have any family, maybe for me it wasn't that much of a problem to be arrested, but what about people who have children to take care of? What will happen if you get arrested for 30 days, for several months, and maybe for years? What if you have to take care of your elderly relatives? What if you have some people with disabilities in your family? What if you are the only provider? What about that? And I'm very angry when people are saying these things. Why people just don't do this? Where's like the intersectional lens when you're looking at it? And at the same time, you know, still people who are from very vulnerable groups, they were risking their safety for years and years and years to fight police with their bare hands, to go to the street protests, to go to prison. But it is impossible to make a grassroots resistance when you have millions of untrained, unarmed people, when you have a lot of people with different health conditions, and when your enemy is the fully trained army of internal police officers with all the variety of weapons who are specifically trained to turn down, to oppress any protest in the first second that it starts. So my big ask for everyone to, if you hear this argument why Russian people are just not doing a revolution, to give this kind of a context, because making street protests in democracy is completely, in democratic state, it's completely another tool of a protest than trying to make a street protest in authoritarian regime when police can commit crimes and murder people without having any responsibilities and any consequences after.
But actually, like, people protesting in Russian Federation. Like just a few months ago, we had protests in Bashkortostan Republic against opening a mine on a sacred mountain, and hundreds of people were arrested. They are in prison now. These people are mostly like indigenous people of Bashkortostan, normal people even. They are not even like activists like we are. And in Western world, in Western media, there is no information about it. These people right now, they need help for lawyers and a lot of other things, and there is no help for them. And and like they are being marginalized by all parts of like European politicians, by Russian liberal opposition. They say these people are separatists and whatever, even though these people were fighting against exploitation of their nature. And this you don't hear about most of the protests in Russian Federation because these people, they don't have publicity. For example, like you know that Navalny was killed, and it's a terrible tragedy for all of us because he was an important oppositional figure. But before that, 3 people were killed in Bashkortostan Republic while they were protesting. Like 2 persons died in detention. One is now in terrible conditions, and yeah, and a lot of people like 60 years old, 70 years old, they are being in prison, and they can face like 15 years in prison by these like accusations to them, and they were just peacefully protesting against the arrest of their activists. So usually you don't know anything about what is happening in Russia. Russia is a huge country, a lot of things is happening in Russia. In every republic it's a completely different context. And when Western media report about something, they say, oh, somewhere in Russia something happened. But it's much more complicated, and this complication is very important to understand them. Because, like, if we want to stop Putin, we need to understand his system of violence, how does it work, how can we resist to it, how can we help people who are prosecuted. And it's obviously not a topic, it's a topic for a completely different discussion, not for an hour or 2. But Europe really doesn't do much to help these people, and also Europe is not doing much to help people in post-Soviet countries where people are also very vulnerable to Russian colonialism, in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, in Georgia, in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Or right now, for example, for this terrorist attack, or like Putin is blaming Ukraine, obviously, and also they are blaming Tajik people, even though they are also a minority in Russia, they are migrants in Russia, they are very vulnerable, and nobody is helping these people, nobody is speaking up about it, nobody really cares about it, yeah? You don't know about what is happening. So I think it's really important to know these kind of things too.
Yeah, and also Europe has a huge responsibility for the result that we have, where Putin has so much power, and Putin's terror, Putin's authoritarianism didn't start yesterday. Political murders in Russia didn't start yesterday. The murders and tortures of activists, of environmental activists, of oppositional activists, of independent journalists, of all sorts of people who are pro-democracy, against the regime, against the crimes of Putin's Russia, it didn't start yesterday. It was happening regularly, constantly during the 24 years of Putin's reign, while European countries were fully aware of it, and they were still very comfortable of making this business as usual with Putin, buying cheap fossil fuels, while being fully aware how Putin's government is destroying human rights in Russia, is torturing and murdering people in Russia. And now they woke up and saying, oh, we have nothing to do with it, we're against Putin terrorist state, and all the people in Russia are responsible. Yes, we are responsible, because we are Russian citizens, and what's happening in our country is our, job. But at the same time, European governments who were allies of Putin and who were making this business with Putin, they are also responsible, and they have to take this responsibility. And right now, I don't see enough help from European governments to Russian civil society, to Russian activists, to Russian political prisoners. They're just always saying that they're concerned, but where is the real help? It's not enough, and it's incompatible to the level of money that they're still paying Russian government for fossil fuels. And the last point that I want to mention before we move to more horizontal kind of discussion is another thing that makes us angry. Today is a list of things that makes us angry. So another things that makes us angry, we already talked about how Russia is a colonial authoritarian, imperialistic state, and how Putin has this colonial imperialistic ambition. But the funny thing is, and the most cynical thing is, that Russian propaganda is also a huge machine of terror. And Russian propaganda has this specific narrative which is focused on the leftist communities in the West. And this narrative, the goal of this narrative is to sell the image of Russia as the anti-imperialistic, anti-colonial, anti-NATO, anti-USA state. So Russian propaganda is always saying that Russia is like an alternative power to the American evil empire, that Russia is against NATO, that Russia is supporting the most vulnerable nations in this, fight for multi-polar world. And this is a complete bullshit, because this narrative only works if you are not aware that Putin is a colonial aggressor, that he has imperialistic ambition, that he is performing violence against indigenous lands, indigenous people, people of different nations inside the country. And I met a lot of leftists during last year and a half in Europe who told me, but Putin is a lesser evil. Who had the audacity to tell me, a person who had to flee the country, who faced police brutality, who was arrested multiple times, who had a terrorism case against me, telling me that Putin is a lesser evil, that he is fighting imperialism, and that he is fighting NATO, and this is a great thing. This is such a bullshit, and this is such an ignorant position. I'm also seeing a lot of older people from the leftist communities who are trying to push this narrative. And I have a question, like, didn't you have enough time to educate yourself on the subject? Like, you are not, like, you had plenty of time, you lived a long life. How come you don't know the context? And why people who never lived in Russia, who never experienced authoritarian oppression, are telling me, older people, that they are smarter, they are wiser, they have more experience to tell me that Putin is a lesser evil and NATO is the main evil. This is a complete bullshit. And this is very offensive to us, and this is very, also, paternalizing, not really like, being in line with leftist, anarchist, great values that we need to share. So I think, we were talking about coalition, we were talking about international, coalitions and helping each other out. I think another thing that you can do if you are citizens of other countries, not to let this narrative of Russia as anti-imperialistic state and Putin as the lesser evil spread around the leftist communities. It's very important to address this because we are so tired of it. Talk to your allies, talk to your communities, and stop this Russian propaganda, because this narrative is a Russian propaganda. And we, of course, are against American imperialism. We are against, personally, I'm an anarchist, I'm a leftist anarchist, I'm against governments in general. But we have to not to see Putin as an alternative, because he will destroy everything that is good in this world if he has a possibility to do so. And he hates leftist ideas, he hates feminism, he hates decolonial struggle, he hates environmental struggle, because his only power is coming from fossil fuels. And he has nothing to do with this anti-imperialism. And if he had power, he would like us all in this room to be dead and silent.
Should we start the discussion?
Yeah, please. I don't know, maybe, do we need other mics, or we can just give the mic to people who want to add something, or...
Ask questions. We are happy to answer your questions.
Or maybe you have something to say. Raise your hand, please, if you need... And there is also a person with a microphone. Also, I forgot that we had another slide, the second slide of our two-slide presentation, where we gathered several links, just a few links to different decolonial, indigenous projects, activist groups, so you can learn more about this decolonial, anti-colonial struggle in Russia, about feminist anti-war initiatives. So you can just take a picture of these links and then maybe, you know, find something. Don't be afraid when you go to Instagram page and everything is in Russian. You can scroll a bit, and activists often do like summaries in English and post in English for international audience. So yeah, of course it's just a few.
Or you can ask your media to make interviews with these activists and movements, because people in Europe, they should know the real truth.
Yeah, so if you have any questions or any remark, please raise your hand. Let's make this. We would love to hear what you think or what you feel.
Hi, thank you. I'm here. Sorry. So I talked recently to a Russian friend of mine who told me she was talking with people she grew up with who still live in Russia, and she noticed that they didn't make the connection between like bad things that are happening in Russia and a government that is responsible for them. So I think it was a banal example like bad roads or something like that, and she was saying like, yeah, it's because of corruption, there's not enough money going to, for example, remaking a road. And that the woman she was talking to like didn't recognize that there was a connection, and that theoretically in a democracy, if you are not happy with how money is allocated, you can vote for somebody else. So I wanted to ask about your experiences doing activism in Russia. How do you even raise the awareness that it is possible that there is that another way of governing is possible if people lived for such a long time under Putin and also just under a dictatorship?
I think the action is their only needed answer. Like I started to protest every Friday about climate crisis, and before that, most of the Russian people were thinking that climate change is good for Russia. We will be growing bananas and stuff like that. But then, like we were protesting, we were organizing the movement, we were translating articles from English. And then at the summer in 2019 we had huge wildfires, and somehow Russian people started to talk about climate crisis, and then floodings in 2019 in Irkutsk. And so action is the only answer. If you want to stop this to fight against this kind of propaganda, because propaganda's goal in Russia is also to depoliticize people, to make them think that they cannot make any difference, they cannot change everything, everything is actually normal, and what is happening is terrible, but it's normal. Yeah, they want us to think that we cannot do anything, but action is the only way to change this. We need to inspire people, and that's why probably our Russian anti-war movement should need more support and help, because if we will be kind of inspirational examples for Russian people, that would be better, because for now we are just poor, repressed activists.
Yeah, and I want to add that the resistance is still happening in Russia right now while we are talking. We just have a privilege to be here with our open faces, open names, not anonymously, because I guess we have nothing to lose already. We are in all the possible lists, and there's no place to hide for us anymore. But there are still, I already told it, millions of people in Russia who are against the regime, and many thousands of people who are organizing in a partisan way, anonymously on a grassroots level, doing affinity groups with the people they know, trying to grow civil society in Russia, trying to still fight the propaganda, because there's also a problem that all the independent media is blocked in Russia, and all the independent journalists, most of them are kicked out of Russia. So there's a huge, wall between millions of Russian people and the independent news, independent information. That is also a problem. and not all the people have access to the internet. For example, older people, they don't sometimes they not use internet that much, or if they use it, they don't know how to use VPN to get access to this independent media. So even solving these problems on the grassroots level in Russia is also a huge work. And for example, in Feminist Anti-War Resistance, we specifically were thinking how to work with this part of population who are people in their older age who not used to use internet or VPN, but they need to get some news. So we started doing this partisan newspaper. So we're doing a newspaper that looks like a regular, you know, free newspaper, entertainment newspaper from your neighborhood. But when you read it, this is like anti-war content. This is the content about women, political prisoners, about the injustice system, about the economical consequences of the war in Ukraine, about how Russian soldiers who were released from prison for terrible crimes to be able to go and fight and kill Ukrainian people are now walking freely back in Russia because the president made them free. Because right now in Russia, I don't know if you know about it, you can be a murderer, a rapist, a person who was sentenced for many years in prison, but then you can be released after making a contract with the Russian army. So you just make this contract, you go to war in Ukraine. If you're lucky to survive, then you're coming back to your hometown, and then president makes you free, and you don't even have a criminal record, so even your criminal record is erased. And already many horrible criminals, such as rapists and people who abuse children, and people who killed many people, they are walking freely in Russia, and the president is the person who signed the papers, so they are no longer criminals. And we are spreading in this newspaper things like that. And a lot of people doing other things. I want to bring a spotlight on the thing that not only straightforward anti-war activism is important. To grow civil society, you need to focus also on the problems of different vulnerable groups. For example, what about people with disabilities? What about of environmental problems as well? What about of helping kids who also are facing the oppression in schools, because educational system in Russia is now very oppressive and promotes this propaganda, infiltrates it into the educational program. This is also a spheres where Russian civil society and activists are trying to working underground in a partisan way, because at this, like risking every day their safety, because now you can go in prison for just making a post on social media with wrong words, or just having wrong color like in your clothes, like symbols of Ukraine or something like this, or just being in the wrong time in the wrong place. So nothing is safe, but people are still doing this, and I think it should be seen. And I always say, and we in Feminist Anti-War Resistance always say, that Russian resistance is only possible when there are people who are, majority of people who are staying inside Russia and who are against the regime, and some people who left the country, who are working together every day, who are in touch together every day, building strategies and using, because some things are not possible today to do outside of Russia. And these things this is the job of people inside of Russia. And our job to do things that are possible, not possible to be done inside of Russia. So this is this kind of intersections that is happening every day. And there's also, I think, propaganda was tried to push this kind of narratives to make people who left the country and people who stayed fight. You know, like saying that people who left don't care about people who stayed don't hate people who left. Of course, there are some examples, and this is normal, but still I don't know any NGO, any activist initiative, any partisan group, any oppositional initiatives in Russia who don't have people who are both inside and outside of Russia. So we are also trying to make this visible to the outside world, because it's important to have this wider picture of what's going on. Sorry for such a long answer, but maybe somebody has. Thank you. Maybe somebody else has something to say. We still have 1 more hour. I see a hand over there. Yeah.
If you don't ask questions, we will start ask questions to you.
Yeah, thanks for being here and sharing your insights. Earlier today there was a talk from a group of indigenous people from British Columbia in Canada, and you mentioned the protests in Bashkortostan, which, as far as I understand, were some of the largest, possibly before the death of Navalny, of course. But yeah, I was wondering how large of an impact you currently see from these indigenous groups, how powerful they are, how well connected they are, also within a leftist or anti-regime framework, especially since I think those certain indigenous groups are also more heavily affected by recruitment, right, to the war. Yeah, so would just be wondering what's your position on this and the perspective of indigenous groups working with leftist groups. What's the current picture, and also how to support indigenous groups or leftist groups from Vienna. Yeah, I hope the question was approximately clear.
Some of the indigenous groups are quite large, but the problem and the thing is not about numbers, because if you are a minority in Russia, if you are an indigenous person, you are being marginalized, and your risks are much higher if you speak up. So the price you pay for your words are much higher. For example, I was a minority and I protested, I spoke up against the war, and then my family was deported. And even Navalny's family is doing fine in Russia, besides his brother who was arrested for a few years. So the price is really high for indigenous people, for minorities, but since racism and inequality of different kind of people in Russia is also real, these people, they understand that they are not equal to Russians, so I think there is a lot of anger in them, and if there will be enough support, and if we will be kind of helping activists who are just starting to build new movements, a lot of after the beginning of full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian indigenous people and Russian people from different republics, they started a lot of new movements, and it's crucial now to support them. And we will see what will be happening, because there is a lot of anger in Russian minorities, there is a lot of anger in indigenous people, and right now it's not about numbers, it's about, the truth is really a powerful thing. If you support them, and they are telling the truth, obviously, then I think Russia really can change, and these changes will be not like if we just changed Putin to some another guy who is also a dictator, but we need kind of real systematic changes. Maybe it won't happen tomorrow, maybe it won't happen in 2 years, but if it happens, then it will be much safer for Europe to live with such a neighbor, and it will be much better for all people who are living in Russian Federation. So, with the climate crisis, if we start doing something today, even if you are one person, if you are 5 persons, you can make a lot of impact. It's not about how many people you have on the streets. When we were organizing the climate movement in Russia, we were just a few people on the street, but still it was really important for Russian civil society, for Russian people. So in Russia, it's not like in Europe that you start doing something, then tomorrow you have 100,000 followers and you organize protests for 10,000 people. It's not like that, it's different.
I would also add that if you have capacities, for example, you have a platform, or you're a journalist, or you're a blogger, you can also try to, research some information about Russian indigenous struggle, and use your platform to bring a spotlight to the struggle and make your audience know and aware that this struggle exists in the first place. So, yeah.
And don't wait before like indigenous people will start texting you and asking for help. Usually we don't have capacities. We are just a few activists and like who are doing most of the work. So if you want to help, text to these activists, ask what can you do, and also share your platforms with them, raise awareness in your circles. Because when we were organizing a protest about the blockade of Nagorno-Karabakh in Berlin, we were just 10 or 15 Armenian people, and European people, they were just silent, they were ignoring what we were doing. But it doesn't mean that this topic was not important. Afterwards, 100,000 indigenous people were deported. It is really huge. And it's not about numbers, it's about solidarity and building a different world. Like the world we are living is the world with business as usual, with climate catastrophe, and if we want to build something different, we probably will start from small numbers. That can happen.
Any more questions or comments or thoughts? I see some hands in the back. Or maybe start there and then in the first row.
Thanks so much for the interesting talk. I was wondering whether you know anything about Austrian multinational corporations working in Russia, for instance, the OMV or the Raiffeisenbank.
What do you mean? We know
if you know any, how they're involved in local struggles, what are they doing on the ground, if there are any scandals, whatever, something like that.
We don't know much about Raiffeisenbank and Austrian companies, but there are a lot of European companies which are still providing Russia some components for weapons, and it shouldn't be happening for sure. And there are some Russian journalists who are making investigations about this kind of stuff, and it's really important to stop providing Russia with weapons for sure. But we don't know much about these companies, and
I would add that about Raiffeisenbank, it was a big scandal, but I was not surprised because the history of Russian relationships with Austria is it's a great history and a great business friendship and everything, and we know how many right-wing politicians were, for these 24 years, were making a lot of deals with Putin. And also there was this huge Ibiza gate, as I think all of the people from Austria knows, the corruption case. And for me, Austria is one of those countries, one of the rare example that Russia doesn't hate directly, because there are a few countries that have strategical interest of Russia, and I think Austria with its neutrality is one of them, because this neutrality is beneficial for Putin's regime, because Austria still buys fossil fuels, Austria still brings money to Russia, and at the same time Austria is neutral in a military way, which is beneficial right now. So this is a very problematic, long relationship between Austria and Russia, and for us it's important to address it. And I think the simplest thought and the simplest message that I can address in this whole context of Austrian-Russian relationship is, if you want to help us to fight Putin, please don't let right-wingers win in Austria. Please don't let Freedom Party win in Austria, because we know that a lot of Putin's friends are in these right-wing parties and initiatives, and a lot of right-wing initiatives are financed by Kremlin all over Europe, not only in Russia. So if you don't have resources to work with Russian activists directly or spread information about the Russian indigenous struggle, please just fight right-wingers in your country, and it will make Putin weaker. There was also, I think, a comment here.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to ask the person who was talking about indigenous, decolonial activists and leftists, if I understand you correctly, that your question was kind of leftists and indigenous decolonial activists are together, or like indigenous activists are leftists?
Yeah, like how? No, I was wondering how for leftist organizations that are not specifically located in regions or indigenous are how they're working together with struggle from indigenous people, and how if there's some kind of synergies, you know, or if they are more separate in their actions.
Yeah, it's a little bit problematic because, for example, even after full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we are indigenous people had to educate activists from Moscow and St. Petersburg that just let them know that we exist. Not all of them know about it. And yes, and also for leftists, if they are Muslims, so they kind of excluded them from the struggle.
Russian opposition is also very racist. That's a problem, and yeah.
Yeah, it's also a problem of building a coalition in Russia. Often there is this point of view from the West that Russia has this opposition with Navalny team in the head of it, which is complete bullshit, because Russia is huge and diverse and there are a lot of oppositional movements. We try to collaborate with each other, but it's not a monolith. And it's hard for us to collaborate sometimes because there are more liberal people, they are right-wingers as well, like some right-winger kind of opposition as well. There are more leftist people, there are anarchists, there are like a lot of different people, but we are still, for example, I think the full-scale invasion in Ukraine was a very big challenge for Russian oppositions to find the way to collaborate, even in the situation when we hated to do this. Because I don't want to collaborate with liberals, you know, I don't like it at all as an anarchist, and of course I would never collaborate with right-wingers, but still to build certain mutual aid system in Russia, to help Ukrainian refugees, to organize wide anti-war protests inside Russia and outside of it, we had to find some kind of, consensus in a way. It doesn't mean that we are agreeing with each other, but sometimes we have to collaborate, but sometimes it's still impossible because some people are still fucking racist and sexist and misogynist inside the Russian opposition. So yeah, this is a problem, and but I think we are, as more leftist representatives, are trying to use to do what we can to address these issues inside the opposition as well. Any more comments? I see two hands in the back.
You talk about these people in the Russian opposition having all sorts of prejudices. I didn't think there was a Russian opposition in Russia. So that's really surprised me. And you know what? I would really love to see activists arguing against Putin who are not white. You know, I've never come across in my whole experience of arenas like this where I've seen anti-Putin, etc. activists who are just Muslim or brown-faced or black-faced. It feels like an absolute conceptual impossibility. Sometimes you wonder, how do we penetrate the mind of Russia? How do we penetrate Putin's mind? How can we unravel the knot so we can actually get to light at the heart of darkness How do you think, the question coming out of my statement, how do we penetrate this Gordian knot, this opacity, which is Russia, the Russian state?
I can answer to your question. Like, I'm not actually Russian. I'm an Armenian person, and and in the opposition we have also a lot of people from the colonial movement, and they are Muslim. They are not white, yeah. And I am also not white. In Russia, when I was a kid, they were calling me black, and they were saying that I am whatever, a lot of slurs. So, if we want to penetrate, and if we want to have a real influence on Russia, we need to understand that Russia is a very racist country, and we need to start working against it. And we also need to understand that Russia there are a lot of different kind of people. And Putin is trying to divide all of us, and then we are weaker if we are divided. And so I think we really need to have more representation in Russian opposition too. We need to have every kind of person. We need to support all activists from all kind of republics, all kind of minorities in Russia. It's very important. And yeah, it's true that Russian opposition didn't do this work quite well. They were trying to be populist, they were trying to say what people want to hear, but that tactic led us to this catastrophe. And now we are trying to find new strategies, and there is the decolonial movement, the struggle of the decolonial movement, it didn't start like 2 years ago. It's like after the collapse of Soviet Union, Russia had a war in Chechnya, yeah, 2 wars actually. And these wars, they were also colonial wars. And we need to be changing Russian attitudes to Russian history. We should be talking more about colonialism on international level, on Russian level, and we are doing that. Yeah, we are changing the Russian opposition. It's not an easy task, and we are just a few activists, and we all are living in very difficult circumstances, yeah, but we are doing that kind of work, and we are trying to penetrate Russia and to change Russian system.
I also think that if you want to see more people of different ethnical backgrounds on the events, you can also try to reach out and to research, because I often face the problem that I am invited a lot to the certain events just because somebody saw me on some events, and I try to use this privilege to make other names seen and connect organizers or journalists with to people with different other groups and with different background, with different ethnicity, and at the same time you can use these feelings that we specifically put in this slide, so you could research a bit more and you can see other voices of Russian opposition. You could see specifically indigenous voices of Russian opposition. As I've mentioned before, it's very sad that a third person, Yana Tanagasheva, who is an indigenous activist, ethnically not Russian, couldn't participate today because it was such a short notice. But I think it's important for all of us to help people who don't have much visibility be seen and heard and make these connections. And I would also add about penetrating Putin's mind. I am so not interested in penetrating Putin's mind because it's so clear to me what's happening in his mind. He's a war criminal. He is a criminal in general. He is a mafia guy. He is a toxic masculine white man, 70-year-old man, no ageism here, but just a certain very problematic social group. And he doesn't have empathy. He doesn't value human lives. He sacrificed lives of Russian people many, many times. He, when the terrorist attack happened on Friday, it took him 20 fucking hours to say something publicly. 20 hours when more than 130 people were shot to death. And this is a person who, made so many horrible, horrible crimes that his mind doesn't have to be penetrated. He is his image is so obvious. His mind is so obvious, and the only thing that we need to focus on is how not to let him gain even more power that he already has with the help of other governments, other politicians, fossil fuel business, etc., etc.
Yeah, the question is, what can we do not to allow Putin to penetrate in Europe? Yeah. Because he's trying to penetrate here, and like a lot of people in Europe, they are influenced by his propaganda, and a lot of Western journalists, they are especially going to Russia to give him a platform, and we think that these Western journalists, Western media, they should be sharing their platform with Russian indigenous people. And they don't do it because they are afraid that the Russian indigenous people will raise uncomfortable questions about Europe buying more gas from Russia, Europe buying a lot of other things from Russia, not just gas, nickel and a lot of other things. Russia is a very rich country. So yeah, you should be asking these questions not to us, but to your journalists, why they don't give their platforms to indigenous Russian people. You should be asking these questions to your politicians, why they were building these gas pipelines instead of helping Russian civil society to fight against dictatorship. These are questions not to us, these are questions to your government.
There was another hand in the back as well, behind the person that just... Oh, okay, I think, okay.
My question is, what role, in your opinion, does China play in stabilizing Putin's power? Like, what kind of picture does the Russian propaganda draw about China?
We don't talk about China in Russia like you do in Europe or in the US. China is ally of Putin because it's also a dictatorship, and Putin is really trying to get help from China for this war. And China is obviously influencing neighboring regions, and Russia is selling a lot of lands to China, and they are exploiting these lands and actually destroying these lands because the way they do the business is really terrible for nature, and it's really not a good thing. But at this moment, yeah, we don't talk much about China. We have other problems.
I also have nothing to add to this, sorry. And there was a person at the back.
Thank you for your input and for being here in general. I had a question about how could the European left kind of engage with the war, or how could position itself other than a way of waving a Russian flag. And while the complexity of this is enormous, with Ukraine obviously having the right to armed resistance and armed self-defense, but also it evolving into this industrial clash of different capitalisms, while there are such weird things as nitrate exports from Russia to the EU, which have increased by 4 times since the start of the war, which is also the raw material for explosives and based on natural gas. So yeah, I don't know.
I think the problem was that Europe was not helping Ukraine enough after the beginning of war in 2014. If Europe would help Ukraine more in 2014, then this full-scale invasion, it just wouldn't start. And it's like with the climate crisis. Yeah, the cost of fighting climate crisis now is quite high. But if we won't be doing it now, then tomorrow or day after tomorrow, it won't be about cost, but it will be about survival, as it is today for many, many nations, yeah? I was also wondering about this kind of stuff. I am living in Germany, and all this Western world, all the world actually, they couldn't gather 100 billions for green funding at the UN level for a climate conference, and then somehow the war started, and now Germany is going to spend 100 billion to arm themselves. But they're not arming Ukraine, they are arming themselves. It's not about helping Ukraine. A lot of like politicians using this war to arm their countries, and they are starting like, they do not want to help Ukraine. Really, till today, Germany doesn't send like towers, rockets, or whatever to Ukraine, yeah? And they were very reluctant to send to Ukraine tanks and to jets. And yeah, these hundreds of billions money when we are talking about, it's not about helping Ukraine, it's about arming a lot of countries, not Ukraine. And they don't really care about Ukraine, these politicians. They are just trying to use this opportunity to spend a lot of money on this kind of stuff. But yeah, if we won't be helping Ukraine, if we won't be helping Ukraine to resist to Russian colonialism, this war and Russian dictatorship will come to Europe, and yeah, we don't really have a choice. And the same with climate crisis, yeah? We need to have also some technological solutions. Yeah, we need to have renewable energy, but renewable energy is not the only solution. That's why we are also talking about supporting Russian anti-war resistance, supporting Russian indigenous people to stop this war. Yeah, but so it's a really complex thing. You don't have a silver bullet to stop everything at the same time, and you also need to think critically about the actions of your government. Obviously, yeah, it's true they use everything to promote their agendas. Like Germany is building a lot of like new gas stations, as PG or whatever, yeah, and all these governments, they are using like all opportunities to like do a lot of terrible things for our future, for our present. Yeah, it's true. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be supporting Ukraine. In contrary, we should be supporting more Ukraine to stop the war, and then in a peace times, we will be able to kind of do something together to stop the climate crisis and other problems.
Yeah, I will also add that if the war in Ukraine and its results are very dependent on, the Putin's regime, in a way, like Putin's regime is dependent on whether Russia will win in this war or will lose. And for us as Russians, when I say opposition, we are not like official opposition. There is no official opposition in Russia. When I say oppositions, I mean people who are against the regime, activists and initiatives. So for us, it is crucial that Ukraine will not be defeated in this war, and that Ukraine will win, because if Ukraine will lose, we will also lose, and Putin will gain even more power. And I am very critical about the idea that stopping war now and negotiating with Putin would lead us to peace. It won't, because it didn't happen already one time, and everyone was very, a lot of countries in Europe, was, as you already mentioned, were very, okay with giving Putin the Crimea, saying and justifying it like, okay, he will just take the Crimea and then it will be peace. But it didn't work. 8 years later, he wants to occupy the whole country. And now since we are Russian citizens and we are monitoring the news often, and we're seeing all his speeches, all his public statements, we know how he talks about Baltic countries. We know how he talks about the post-Soviet, so-called post-Soviet territories, because he is very clear about his imperialistic ambitions and bringing back the empire. He says terrible things about other countries in Eastern Europe and about their right to be independent and about its fake independence and so on. So while Putin is in charge, war will never stop. And negotiations with Putin is impossible because he always lies. He never holds his word. It is impossible, and it feels like other countries are going through this trap all over and over again, trying to make these negotiations, but at the same time, the only, I think, wish to stop the war for a lot of European governments is just to continue their business as usual. So they don't care that much about the lives of Ukrainian people or the lives of Russian people. They just want a peaceful time for themselves, and they want less problems for themselves. That's how I see it.
Yeah, you obviously, like, the economic system in the world is wrong, yeah? Right now, like, Europe is talking, like, shouldn't we stop, yeah, I don't know, supporting some countries to resist to Russia, but then they are supporting Azerbaijan to prepare another war. Like, Azerbaijan right now is threatening to start war against Armenia. And so I really think this, like, in 2019, I remember when we started to do climate activism, a lot of countries, they declared climate emergency, yeah? I don't know if it happened in Austria, but it happened in the UK, in all over Europe actually. Europe declared climate emergency. But then somehow they forgot that they did it, and now they don't talk about climate anymore. And they are helping dictators to launch new wars. So yeah, we should be changing a lot of things. We should be changing the economy, we should be changing ourselves. Europe is also quite racist. And instead of changing migration policies to help other countries who are suffering from wars and climate, Europe is just making more restrictions for migrants. Europe is making, it's also not a good thing, but yeah, probably this discussion is not about that. But there are a lot of problems, and we need to be doing a lot of things. We need to really to change our world, because what is happening right now is leading us to a really catastrophe, civilizational catastrophe.
I see a hand over there, second row.
Yeah, I just wanted to, my name is Haliki and I'm from Estonia, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for everything you've said. It's been a long struggle, like trying to talk to the Austrian left, the German left about this, and then feeling like you're between a stone and like a hard place and a rock. And thank you for educating people here about Russia as a colony. And I think it's a very difficult place for leftists to argue for the necessity to continue fighting and not to give up. And I actually had a question which I've now forgotten, but the main thing was to thank you. Yeah, I have this feeling that a bigger problem is that Russia has never had to sort of contend with its imperial past, and there is even in great Russian literature, there's a level of chauvinism and there's like Russian greatness, and I don't know how we can decolonize Russia without that going away. And I love that you're here, and I think you're both really great examples of this like very small minority of people that are against it. And in my experience, even sort of progressive Russians tend to have this idea of Russian greatness. And yeah, I don't know, what can we do against that? Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's true that Russian culture is also very problematic, and like actually all cultures are very problematic. The culture in the US, and that's the thing, that like when you have an independent normal schools, in schools you talk and look at these books with critical thinking, and we don't have it in Russia because in contrary, in schools we now have these lessons about important stuff, and they put propaganda in kids, and it's really important to fight against that too, yeah? And if you want to change Russian culture, you need to be supporting indigenous culture. Like 2 days ago, we organized an event about Bashkortostan, and then people were talking about their own languages. Bashkort people, they have their own language. Tatar people, they have their own languages. So, and the people in Europe, they don't know that people in Russia, they speak different languages. And we should be supporting these kind of things. We should be supporting, like all these people in Russia, they have their own culture, they have their own myths, they have their own literature, and in schools we don't learn about it, and in Europe you don't know about it, and we should be supporting people who are writing new books about Russian colonialism. There are a lot of them. Activists, they are writing poems, they are making new music, they are promoting their indigenous practices, music, and we should be supporting that. It's not an easy thing. If you start doing that tomorrow, probably nothing will change. But then, in 5 years, maybe Russian system will change. Yeah, so it's not an easy task, obviously. It's not something you can do today and then tomorrow a miracle will happen. No, it's not an easy thing.
I would also like to bring a little, like a tiny bit of optimism here, because there's a lack of optimism right now everywhere. I just want to say, like, to continue what you've said, like, this is not a sprint, this is a marathon, what we are doing worldwide, in terms of how enormous are the right-wing powers worldwide. But, for example, since I'm a feminist activist from Russia, I can say that 10 years ago, the feminist movement in Russia wasn't even like 50% of what it is now. It grew very quickly, regardless of repressions, regardless of arrest, regardless of all the traditional values that were put on us by Russian government, regardless of all these gender stereotypes that we learned from the early age in Russia. Feminist movement in Russia was growing on a very high speed during last 10-15 years. And if 10-15 years ago you could say that, oh, I know some feminist initiatives in Russia, in St. Petersburg and Moscow, now and for many years by now already, there are so many feminist initiatives in all of the regions of Russia. In Far East regions, in the north of Russia, in the east of Russia, everywhere. And we were able to build a huge network of feminist projects all over this huge country. We were able a huge system of mutual aid helping women who are facing domestic violence, gender-based violence in general. And as you might heard, Russia is one of the countries who have the most high level of gender-based violence in the whole world. And we don't have any laws that effectively protect women and children and even elderly people from domestic violence. So all the enormous work, and again, I remind you, there are 140 million people living in Russia, and almost every second woman faced gender-based violence, as in Russia, as in the whole world. So all this work of protecting women against gender-based violence lies on the shoulders of feminist movements, grassroots initiatives, NGOs that were developed by feminists, by activists, independent foundations raising money to help the victims of violence. And this became a really working network, despite of the government which tries to oppress us as a feminist movement. And I think this is example how even in a very severe environment, political environment, you can still develop mutual aid, you can still grow civil society, you can still grow certain humanitarian values. And for example, I remember how like 7 years ago, Navalny team and all these like liberal oppositionists were making fun of feminists and saying that we are these angry women with hairy armpits and doing some bullshit. And now they are supporting, at least they respect us a little more. At least they're supporting some of our foundations. They're speaking about violence against women. And this is not their, you know, the result of their work. This is the result of our work and us fighting for our rights and us fighting for all of them to respect us, respect our work. And I think this is very important. And I also want to add about the queer struggle in Russia. And you know, I don't know if there's any other country where LGBT movement was named extremist movement. And if you haven't heard of it, Russia named LGBT, they call it international and LGBT movement and extremist movement. So if you are a queer person in this place, know that you are considered extremist by Russian state right now. So queer people in Russia, specifically transgender people, are one of the most, I would say maybe the most vulnerable group right now. Because also last year, Russia banned gender transition, I don't know the specific word of the law, so like gender transition was banned in Russia. And trans people are facing very great danger in Russia right now. And it also happened before. They were never safe in Russia because we knew attacks towards queer people and trans people in Russia. We had this law against LGBT propaganda in Russia already established 10 years ago. And still, like, actually when this happened, when they named LGBT extremist movement, I was thinking that there will be some kind of a huge wave of support worldwide for queer movement in Russia, for queer people in Russia, for queer families in Russia. And I didn't see it at all. Even though it's an enormous shocking news that the government names LGBT worldwide an extremist. And there was no like large-scale support. Queer people in Russia and trans people are still facing a lot of difficulties trying to flee the country. It's not that easy to get asylum or a visa when you're a queer person from Russia, when you're an extremist, when you can be put in jail and be tortured and raped by the police. Still nothing is happening. I think it's also the work that can be a common ground for us, you know, addressing these issues to your governments, helping, you know, queer people from Russia to be able to flee, to be able to find support here. And I also think that this example is an example that can maybe be a red flag for people in Europe concerning the right-wingers coming to power more and more often, because only 10 years ago we had just this law naming LGBT propaganda or something. Like, so the law was like you can't talk about LGBT issues to the people who are under 18-year-old. And after, and you know, there were not much protest among liberal opposition against this law. So queer people were fighting against this law, feminists were fighting against this law, but liberals, you know, they often don't want to touch queer issues because, you know, they say it's weird and they don't want to have nothing to do with it because they're all straight, of course, apparently. So whatever. 10 years ago we had that, and a lot of people said, oh, okay, yeah, it's very bad, but it's not like that bad. But now LGBT movement is extremist, and now anything, like all LGBT propaganda is banned. So you can't talk about queer issues even to adults in Russia. It's banned, it's criminalized. And it's only 10 years, it's not such a large period of time in terms of, you know, politics, in terms of how things are evolving. So I think another reason to, you know, be very consistent against right-winger powers in Europe is this example as well. Because I was shocked, I came to Vienna and one of the first protests I saw was protests to support drag queens in Vienna, because there were right-wingers who were making a protest against drag artists, saying that these are some freaks who are trying to spoil our children. This is the quote of these right-wing people. And I was like, where am I? Am I in Europe where there's no such laws discriminating queer people? Why I see so much in common with these, you know, narratives in Europe that I just heard in Russia. So I think the escalation can come really quickly. We have the experience of seeing how quickly they take our rights away and how quickly authoritarianism becomes dictatorship. So I think it's important for you to look at our experience and see what could happen to you in few years if you let these right-wingers win, and if you let Putin win as well, and if you don't support struggle against this regime. That was like, that. It started optimistically but ended very depressing. Sorry. We still have 14 minutes, maybe some other remarks or comments.
Hi, thank you for being here, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, that Austria is still consuming or importing insane amounts of gas from Russia. I think in December it stood at 98% again, which is just unbelievable. Politicians are blaming that on the contract between Gazprom and OMV that dates back to 2018 and basically obliges the corporation to buy gas till 2040. But I think we kind of have to confess that we as civil society, left radical climate justice movements are not really doing much about it either, or we just remain pretty silent. And I don't know, it's not a very clear thought or question, but do you have advice to the Austrian movement in terms of like points of intervention, or maybe do you also just want to share your frustration about that? Thanks.
Yeah, it really shouldn't be being like that. Also, Europe and also probably Austria is buying gas from Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan is also reselling gas from Russia. And it's really terrible, and I don't really understand why climate activists, they don't do more work on about international issues, because there are a lot of radical actions about what is happening in Europe or in the UK, but we are living in a global world, and now what is happening right now, it's a global war, I would say. So yeah, I think climate activists, they should be doing more actions about, yeah, these companies working with Russian oil, gas companies, Azerbaijani gas companies, and that's true. Yeah, I think we should be doing more actions together, or you have more opportunities. So yeah, actually, if you do something like that, it would be really nice. Yeah, protesting is cool.
Also, I would say that, you know, the idea that Austria plans to buy fossil fuels from Russia, gas from Russia for a few more decades because they have contracts, while we are in the middle of climate emergency and while we are all talking about how we need to phase out, phase down, like get rid of this kind of business. Couple of more decades sounds like a horrible, horrible plan. And I think there might be some chances to change how it's planned if you have more leftist government, if you have more people who are pro-environmental struggle in your parliament. That's why voting is important. And I think it would be great if Austria and other countries had used a few time that we have before all these elections to build effective coalitions, to maybe stop fighting between each other. We need to fight, it's valid. I also fight with other representatives of opposition in Russia, but at some point we need to mobilize to outvote right-wingers, and then we can continue fighting with each other. Because with right-wingers in charge, we won't be able to reach our goals, including our environmental goals. So I think if right-wingers will be in charge in Austria, there will be even more decades of business as usual with Russia. So I think we have to look at this direction of this like practical political action.
And by the way, Russia violated a lot of international laws, Russia violated a lot of international agreements, so all contracts which were signed before the war, you can just cancel them. And what can Russia do? Actually nothing. It's just a stupid excuse, yeah? All Russian money in Europe are frozen. We actually don't mind if you use them for building renewable energy and helping Ukraine, yeah? So there are 200 billion Russian monies, and we can do a lot of goods with this stuff. So, yeah, also an optimistic thing, yeah?
But I mean, of course we are aware that it's not a simple task just to switch off Russian gas and start living new environmentally friendly life in the country. Of course it's not possible to do it right away, but still we think that the possibility of this kind of environmental change is only can happen when you have the least power in the hands of the right-wingers. The more power you have in the hands of right-wingers, the least there's less chance that some kind of environmental change is going to happen. So yeah, I think we should look at this from this point of view. Still 9 minutes left, maybe some other comments or thoughts. I can see one hand. Maybe I can give you just...
Hi, thanks so much for the panel. Here's I suppose more of an existential question. What is the best way to fight right-wingers in general, the right-wing movements? What's the best way to counter that? Not fight. Let me take that word back. What's the most productive way to frame an argument, and what's the most productive way of kind of like countering the movement so that there's more left-wing movement and more fair movement as opposed to right-wing and imperialist movements?
I don't think that there is any best way. Like, you want to silver ballot and then tomorrow all right-wing movement is dead. It's not going to work. Yeah, so it's not going to work like that. I think like being active and solidarity is the most effective instrument right now, because if you are helping indigenous people, if you are helping feminists, if you are helping LGBTQ community and building bridges between the movements and between leftists and between other kind of people, because in Europe there are a lot of divisions. So yeah, people argue for hours for different theoretical stuff. Some support Trotsky, some support someone else. And for us, it's about survival. We don't really care about this kind of ideological stuff. We just want to live in our country. We just do not want to be killed. We just do not want to go to criminal war. We just want to be able to speak up. So right now, it's about basic things. So uniting between different groups is the most effective thing. Yeah, not arguing about some theoretical and future problems.
Yeah, I would add that I think it's often more effective and productive to try to talk with people who are not, you know, this kind of right-wing ideology supporters. I think sometimes you will just waste all of your energy and get burned out by trying to make these people understand your values and argue with them. But there are, like, I read the research when they say that there are certain different types of audience. People who are super right-wing, people who are more left-wing, and a huge majority of people who haven't decided yet or who find themselves apolitical or neutral or something like this. And researchers say that it's it's very effective to try to reach the audience who feels that they are apolitical or haven't decided that yet. They don't have enough info to decide. They are not that into politics. And so the most effective way, as they say, and I trust these researchers for some reason, to work with this kind of audience. And I already tried it. And I think sometimes a lot of people, they are so busy with just trying to survive this fucking life under capitalism and these governments that they don't even have time to find certain information, to understand, to know whom to watch, what to read, where to find these different opinions to make their own their own view of the world, of the political situation. For example, I, as a blogger, I always asked from people who follow me for different reasons, like, where can I read about this? Where can I read about that? I often get, like, for example, it depends on who's asking, because, for example, I love when, you know, male activists are asking me where to read about feminism issues, and that pisses me off, because I think you can research if you have internet and not ask me to do a work for you. But there are people who are outside of activism at all, and I think it's great to share and great to help them, to talk to them. Also, I think it's great to organize discussions with people who are not activists at all, and creating space for these discussions and create a safer space for discussions to, you know, practice non-violent communications. And there are a lot of tutorials how to practice it. I think even learning together what is non-violent communication can be a very important political action, because it also helps us build society where, you know, non-violent talk about politics and listening to each other can be possible. So yeah, my idea is trying not to waste your energy on Nazis and like complete misogynists and racists, and trying to speak with people who are somewhere in the middle. And also sometimes, I know that sometimes we don't have these emotional resources to educate other people, but I think sometimes we need to try and see it as a part of our activism. And I know that sometimes people can say very weird stuff about politics, and they can have very weird opinion and even say something misogynistic, but I often was in a situation when I realized that this is not because the person is evil, it's just because the person didn't have enough privilege to be, like, to find this information, to be educated, to, you know, be in the environment of certain people with certain views, to get to know why this is misogynistic and this is not, and how to, you know, have certain beliefs, and while certain beliefs are problematic. So I think we need to be more open, and I think there's also a problem that sometimes activist communities are very closed to the people who are not educated enough in a right activist way. And I think that we have to do this kind of work and be more open. But at the same time, I agree that people who are burnt out and are very tired of educating people and facing misogyny, racism, no matter of what's the reason of it in the first place, they need not to do this work and need to rest. But there are still a lot of us who can do this work. So, yeah. And I think it's, we have 1 minute left to be on time. I don't know if there's another maybe short comment in the back.
So I also wanted to thank you for your very interesting talk, and especially for making a lot of room to talk about the war in Ukraine. I'm from Ukraine, and I don't really see, like, from, I don't know, Austrian, German friends giving like any space or attention for this topic. And because we talked about things that make us angry, and also like diversity in protests, I would be really, really happy to see some protests against Putin, for example, being more diverse. So not only people who are actually like affected by Putin's politics and this war, like not only these people protesting, but also people who are maybe less affected or like not affected. People who grew up in Western European countries and like not leave all this work to Ukrainians or people from Russia or like other people who are affected by this, because it's like really, really frustrating, and I cannot understand why people just leave us so alone with this topic. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I also wanted to mention that we were at 24th of February, we were at the Ukrainian protest demonstration against the second anniversary of war, and 99% of people there were a couple of thousands of people there, were just mostly Ukrainian people and some Russian people. So I haven't seen, like, I think it was like 5% of Austrian people, which I found really strange. And also there is like a community, a very strong community called Russians Against War in Vienna, who are organizing a lot of protests, anti-Putin protests, anti-war protests in Vienna. And most of the time, like, there's like also like 2-3% of Austrian people joining it. So I think it would be great if you could also participate in some demos in solidarity, so we're not left in our own bubble. Yeah, and thank you very much for being with us for, I don't know, maybe my clock doesn't work because it feels like it's been 4 hours, not 2 hours. But thank you so much for staying here with us, and yeah, feel free to reach to us if you have any questions and need any context from Russia. We will be happy to provide you this. And yeah, thank you again.